Okay, so now we're at the second reading, which comes from Paul's letter to the Romans again. We're still in the Romans, the letter to the Romans, just lingering. It's a long letter. It's Paul's longest one, in fact. So I actually, just as an aside, I saw a modern day comparison that, like everything that we do has a value to, so like if we were to write a letter today, a few sheets of paper is like nothing to us, and some ink out of a pen is like nothing to us. For them, it was rather expensive to get the papyrus paper to be able to write, and the ink and stuff. So I saw a modern day comparison. It'd be something between like $1,200 and $2,000 for Paul to write just one copy of the letter to the Romans. So it's incredible. And then to think that the church in Rome received it, and then they made copies so that other people could read the letter as well. And this isn't the only letter that Paul wrote. It's the longest one, easily. It's the longest one, but it's not the only one that he wrote. So anyways, we're spending so much time in it because it's a valuable letter in a number of different ways. Obviously, above all, spiritually, it's a valuable letter, but then also it's long, and there was physical value to it, monetary value to it. So anyway, that was just a little, I guess, apologetics for the letter. The reason to read the letter to the Romans. So Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10. That's our second reading here. So Romans chapter 3, verses 13, 8 through 10. Let's read it. Brothers and sisters, owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not kill, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other commandment there may be, are summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no evil to the neighbor. Hence, love is the fulfillment of the law. Okay, great, excellent. Now, this is good. So just something I want to remind us of, and it's not like an official thing, but anyone who reads these letters, it doesn't need to be official to understand. So when we're reading something from the Bible, it's important for us to understand the context, just like we've been talking about with the letter, the reading from Ezekiel and the reading from the Gospel. It's important to understand the context in which it was written. That, yes, it's good for us to read Scripture and to look for immediate application to our lives, but part of that finding application is going to mean looking at how was Paul, for example, intending this to be read, or as far as like the grand scheme of his letter to the Romans, is it in a particular kind of section? And it is actually. So again, Paul doesn't have these sort of distinctions. He wasn't adding titles or that kind of thing. But in the Bible that I use, which is just a normal New American Bible translation, it's under the section of the duties of Christians. So Paul is writing this letter, and it's this really long thing, that's got a number of different things that he addresses, that he explains. We talked about how, life between the Gentiles and the Jewish converts, and all these different things, and how are they to be brought in, all that. So now he's at a point in the letter where, it's like, okay, the duties of Christians. And we started this last week, actually, with the beginning of chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, where he says, okay, I urge you by the mercies of God to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. So in other words, like, okay, you've received the gospel. You've let your life be transformed. You've been brought into the community, whether from Gentile origin or Jewish origin. However, whether you rejected him at first and hopefully you've been brought into it, now you've been brought into the community. What does that look like for you to be living in the Christian community as a Christian? What are your obligations toward God? What are your obligations toward other people? So we heard again last week that the first obligation of a Christian toward God is to offer his or her body as a living sacrifice, to not be conformed to this world, but instead to be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and pleasing and perfect. So that's like the first obligation. From there, the rest of chapter 12 is very practical, I would say, as far as Paul just sort of laying it out, like this is how you're to live your life. This is the way the Christian ought to live in the world, within the Christian community as well as just within the world. Then chapter 13, it just kind of continues on with that. So that's where we're at here. So when Paul is saying, okay, owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. So what is it that we owe to the people around us? We owe them love as Christians. Why? Because Jesus loved us to the end. He laid down his life for us. This is how God shows his love, in that while we were still sinners, he chose to die for us. He chose to give himself for us. This is the crazy thing. The scandal of the cross in so many ways is that Jesus was innocent, and he had no reason actually to lay down his life for us, except he chooses to do so, and he does it even for us, for you and for me, sinful men and women, so that we might be captured by his radical love. It's crazy. It's crazy. But then, as his disciples, we're called to imitate him in return, and so we owe nothing to anyone, except to love them. What is love? This I think this is important, because he says, what? The one who loves another has fulfilled the law. So how do I fulfill the law of the new covenant? And ultimately, what is the law? So for Paul, as a Jewish Christian, he's thinking of like the Torah. Specifically, he's thinking of the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue. We know the Ten Commandments. So how do I fulfill the Ten Commandments? To love. So that means I see in the Ten Commandments, this is how I can love God. This is how I can love my neighbor. To choose what is good for them. Love is not primarily situated in my feelings or my emotions. That's how we tend to relate to it in today's world, but that's not at all what Paul had in mind. It's not really what Jesus had in mind when he was talking about love. Like, yes, when the feelings and the emotions are there, it's of course very pleasant and wonderful and easy. But even when the feelings are not there, how do I love God? By following his commandments. How do I love my neighbor? By following the commandments that God has given to us as far as loving our neighbor. So that's, I think, just an important thing. So then he says, the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not kill, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and whatever other commandments there may be are summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. This is a quote from Leviticus 19. Of course, we know Jesus also quotes this when he talks about the great commandment, which is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. This is he's quoting, of course, both the Shema from Deuteronomy chapter 9. I think it's 9, maybe it's 6. Somewhere in the book of Deuteronomy is the Shema prayer, the Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord. But then also quoting from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 12, where he says, love your neighbor as yourself. So I think this is so important for us to understand. How do I love God? Well, he tells us how to love him, by keeping his commandments. Jesus himself says this in the Gospels. You are my friends if you do what I command you. Whoever has my commandments and observes them, that is the one who loves me. This is so important to understand. So that if you're searching for in your heart, in your mind, for those pleasant feelings of affection for God, and you can't seem to find them, that doesn't mean that you don't love him. It means you don't have the loving and pleasant feelings of affection, but you can still love him by choosing to keep his commandments. Even when it's undesirable, even when it feels unpleasant, you can choose to do so. And what's more, right? It's not just about loving God. I mean, it is that, of course, but it's additionally that I love God by loving him, and I love God by loving my neighbor. St. John says this, that no one can say, or whoever says he loves God but hates his brother is a liar. So there's a very real connection here, that it's like impossible in some ways to love God without also loving your neighbor. And so this is what Paul is getting at as far as our conduct as Christians, the duties that we owe to each other. Because we love God, is that we then should love each other. We ought to love each other. So that means by following the commandments. So this just last thing real quick here. Really cool thing. So the commandments, the 10 commandments, we could break them up according to like 2 different parts. So there's the first 3 commandments, which are focused on love of God. And then there's the last 7, which are focused on love of neighbor. So, like to not profane the Sabbath, to not commit idolatry, to not blaspheme against the Lord. Those are like the first 3. But then from there, honoring your father and your mother, to not kill, to not steal, to not commit adultery, to not covet. What Paul is getting at here is this we could say like the second part of the 10 commandments. And that's what he's getting at. But of course, it's Paul, and he's writing within the context of people who need to love God as well. And so he's mentioning the second part of the 10 Commandments, while of course, including within his mindset this need to love God, because the two are so connected to each other, and because the context within the letter, within Paul's life, and writing to the Christian community, of course the context is within loving God as well. It's just that sometimes, I think we all know that we need to love God. We don't always know that we need to follow his commandments, I guess. But again, if we're not following the commandments, then we're really not loving God. But anyway, we all know that we need to love God. But sometimes what can happen is because of human interaction, because of sin, and whatever, we can forget that we also need to love our neighbor as ourselves. We need to love our neighbor, even again when I don't feel like loving my neighbor. We need to love our enemies, Jesus actually says, and pray for those who persecute us. And this ultimately, I think, is what Paul is getting at. Love does no evil to the neighbor. Love does no evil to the neighbor. That's something worth reflecting on. Do I have desires to do evil toward my neighbor? Am I doing evil toward my neighbor? Now, if I have desires and I choose not to do so, okay, well, that's actually an act of love. If I have desires and I choose not to do so because I don't want to get in trouble, well, that's not really an act of love. That's self-love. But if I recognize in my heart, in my mind, like I'd really like to punch this person, or I'd really like to cause problems for this person, but because I love God, I'm going to choose not to. Well, that's actually also an act of love toward your neighbor. So anyway, that I think, and then what? Love is the fulfillment of the law. It's all about love, but love in the proper understanding of it. Love in the context of I'm choosing what is good for another person, or I'm choosing what is good for God, for my relationship with Him, for this other person's relationship with God. Okay, there we go. All right, God bless you. Have a great 23rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. I pray, Lord, let your grace descend upon all who watch this, all who share in this. Okay, God bless you. Peace.